My name is Margarita. I'm 36 years old and I'm tired. Not the kind of tired that a weekend away or a long nap can fix, but the kind that settles into your bones. The kind of tired you carry in your shoulders, in your voice, in the way you start to forget what day of the week it is, because every day feels exactly the same. I work full-time, more than full-time if we're being honest. I manage the accounts for a logistics company and often stay up late finishing reports no one thanks me for. I wake up early to prep lunches, walk the dog, throw in a load of laundry, check my inbox before I've even had coffee. I'm the one who remembers the birthdays, keeps the fridge stocked, schedules the dentist appointments, pays the bills, and makes sure there's always gas in the car. If I stopped moving, this house would stop running. I used to be proud of that. Of being the dependable one, the strong one, the glue. But lately, it feels less like strength and more like survival. I've been married to Luis for almost 9 years. When we met, he was charming, funny, spontaneous. He played guitar in a local band and wrote me little songs that made me feel like the center of the universe. Back then, I thought that was enough, that passion and connection could carry us through anything. I didn't care that he didn't have a real job. He said he was figuring things out, and I believed him. I wanted to believe him. After we got married, I assumed things would change, that he'd feel the weight of shared responsibility and step up. But instead, I became the one who stepped into every role: breadwinner, planner, fixer, even therapist. Luis always had a new plan, a new idea, a new almost. He was going to start his own business. He was going to get certified. He had a buddy who knew a guy who could get him into something big. For years, I waited. For years, I carried both of us. It's not that he didn't do anything. He'd make dinner sometimes, pick up groceries if I asked 3 times, drive me to work when my car needed service. But he didn't build anything. Not for us. Not for himself. Just promises. Always just a little out of reach. At first, I defended him. To my friends, to my family, to myself. He's just figuring things out. He's in between things right now. He has a different rhythm. But deep down, I knew. I just didn't want to face it. I told myself love meant patience, that partnership was about belief. And for a while, I still had hope. But it started to fray around the edges. I found myself dreading coming home. Not because he was cruel, Luis was never cruel, but because he was absent. Even when he was there, it was like living with a man-shaped echo. The final crack came on a Tuesday, just a regular Tuesday. I had stayed late at the office trying to fix a client spreadsheet that someone else had messed up. When I got home, Luis was on the couch, headphones in, laughing at something on his phone. The sink was full. The dog hadn't been walked. And I found takeout containers from some new place, even though I'd texted him that morning saying I was planning to cook. I didn't say anything. Not right away. I just stood there for a minute, holding my purse and watching him, wondering what it would feel like to be the person who got to unplug from everything, to float. Later that night, after he'd fallen asleep in front of the TV, I picked up his phone. I hadn't done that in years. I hadn't felt the need to, but something in me had changed. Maybe it was the exhaustion. Or maybe I was finally ready to know what I'd been avoiding. There were messages. Of course there were, not dozens, not anything so obvious. But enough. Enough to see a thread with a woman named Sasha, someone he met at a show a few months ago. Enough to see flirty emojis, late-night wish-you-were-here texts, and one message that just read, "She has no idea." No, I didn't. But now I did. I remember the first night in my new apartment. It was quiet. Too quiet. No TV droning in the background, no cluttered energy swirling around like it used to in the old place. Just me, a single lamp on in the corner, and the dog curled up at my feet, already adapting faster than I ever expected. At first, the silence felt heavy. I paced. I rearranged things that didn't need rearranging. I stared out the window, watching the traffic lights change for no one. But then, slowly, the quiet became something else. It became a kind of peace. I cooked dinner just for me. Real food, not whatever was quick and convenient between working and keeping someone else afloat. I lit a candle, played soft music. I ate slowly, for once not checking my phone, not multitasking. Just existing. And I realized I hadn't done that in years. It wasn't until I was out of that house, out of that role, that I could fully see how much I had shrunk to fit into it. Luis had built a world where his charm excused his lack of effort, where his occasional bursts of affection were enough to keep me hopeful, where I worked and worked and worked while he promised, always promised. Now that I was no longer in that cycle, I started to remember the version of me that used to dream without asking permission. The one who used to laugh loudly, who made spontaneous plans, who didn't need to explain her worth. And while I hadn't planned to watch Luis's life unravel, pieces of it found their way to me. A mutual friend told me he tried to land a job at one of the very companies I used to partner with through my work. But they didn't hire him. Not because of anything I said, but because, well, charm only gets you so far when your resume is as empty as your ambition. Then I heard he moved in with a friend, then back with a cousin. Someone saw him working at a warehouse out of town, and one day, out of nowhere, he texted me. It wasn't an apology, not really, just a string of sad little words. I miss you, I messed everything up. I stared at that message for a long time. Not with tears, not with rage, just clarity. He missed the life I gave him. The stability, the structure, the comfort of having someone who made things easy without ever being asked to. I didn't respond, because I had already spent too many years giving my energy to a man who never truly saw me, who took everything I poured out and still acted like he was starving. Instead, I poured that energy into myself. I asked for more challenging projects at work. I started an online certification I'd put off for years. I traveled, even if just to nearby towns I'd never explored. I went to the beach alone one Sunday and watched the sun sink into the ocean with a kind of awe I hadn't felt in years. It wasn't always easy. There were nights I still missed the idea of Luis, the man he was at the beginning, the one who wrote me songs and called me beautiful in crowded rooms. But I had to remind myself, that version of him existed only in slivers, in carefully timed moments. The real man, the one I lived with, the one who lied, who stayed comfortable while I burned myself out. That man had nothing left to offer me. And what I've learned since leaving him is that healing doesn't always feel like triumph. Sometimes it feels like slow mornings, like saying no without explaining, like finally realizing you were never asking for too much. You were just asking the wrong person. So, no, I didn't get revenge. I didn't need to. Luis punished himself in the end, not with dramatic downfall, but with the quiet weight of a life he never built, a future he never fought for. While I rose from it. Not as someone bitter, but as someone free. A few months after I'd stopped hearing from Luis entirely, I bumped into his sister Carla at the farmer's market. We hadn't spoken since the separation. She'd always been kind to me, but distant, the way people get when they're not sure whose side they're supposed to be on. I was inspecting a bunch of fresh basil when I heard her voice behind me. Margarita? I turned, and for a second, I almost didn't recognize her. She looked thinner, a little tired, but still dressed in that polished, effortless way she always had. We both paused, a bit awkwardly, then smiled. Hey, Carla, I said gently. We chatted about safe topics at first, how work was, the weather, the market being busier than usual, but I could tell she was working up to something. Finally, she said, I heard from Luis a few weeks ago. He's not doing great. I nodded, saying nothing. He's staying with a friend now, doesn't have a car anymore. Said something about the engine giving out and no money to fix it. He said, she hesitated, then looked me in the eye. He said he wishes he could take it all back. I took a breath, steady. I hope he figures himself out, I said. And I meant it. Because the truth was, I didn't wish him harm. I wasn't cheering for his failure. But I also knew that without losing the safety net I had provided for years, he would have never faced himself. Never had to. Carla looked at me for a long moment, then smiled. Genuinely this time. You look lighter, she said. I don't know how else to describe it. I smiled back. That's exactly how it feels. We hugged briefly. That night, I sat on my little balcony with a cup of tea and the smell of basil still lingering on my fingers. I thought about the woman I'd been a year ago, tired, overworked, quietly heartbroken, always giving, always waiting for something to shift. And then I thought about now, how I'd built a new life, not perfect, not flashy, but full of peace. How I no longer apologized for my expectations. How I'd learned to protect my energy like it was the most valuable thing I owned. Because it is. Luis used to say, though, "You're too serious, Margarita. You never relax." But he never understood the weight of being the one who holds everything up. Of course I was serious. Someone had to be. And now I laugh more. I rest without guilt. I dream without limit. He lost me when he thought my strength was a burden. When he thought he could take and take without ever giving back. But I gained something he may never have. Freedom. And that, I've come to believe, is the most beautiful kind of justice. Not revenge, not bitterness, but rising. Quietly. Steadily. Completely. And never looking back. Some evenings, I still sit quietly with a glass of wine and think about how close I came to never leaving. How many times I almost convinced myself to stay, to wait a little longer, to believe, just one more time, that things would change. And every time I think about it now, I feel this odd mix of grief and gratitude. Grief for the years I lost, the years I spent over-functioning, over-loving, overcompensating, carrying both our weights while telling myself that's just what strong women do. And gratitude for the woman I've become because of it. I'm not bitter. That surprised even me. I thought I would be, honestly. I thought I'd be angry forever. But healing doesn't always look like fireworks or some grand breakthrough. Sometimes it's just small things like waking up and not checking your phone for a message that will never come. Or realizing you're no longer trying to prove your worth to someone who never saw it to begin with. One Saturday afternoon, I bumped into an old neighbor from the building where Luis and I used to live. Her name was Eileen, and she used to borrow sugar from me more times than I could count. She recognized me immediately and gave me this wide, almost surprised smile. "You look amazing," she said. "Seriously, there's something different about you." I thanked her and laughed, and before I could stop myself, I replied, "Peace looks good on me, huh?" She grinned. "That's exactly it." We stood there talking for a few minutes, and eventually she told me that Luis still lived nearby for a while after I left. "Always seemed restless," she said. "Coming and going, different people in and out, but never really grounded. Like he was chasing something and didn't even know what." That stayed with me. Because that's exactly what our relationship had felt like at the end. Me anchoring us while he floated further and further out of reach. And when I finally let go, he didn't drift toward anything real. He just drifted. Some people need to hit rock bottom before they find the ground beneath them. I don't know if Luis ever will. I stopped needing that answer a long time ago. What I do know is this. I used to think being strong meant enduring. Now I know it means choosing yourself, even when it's uncomfortable. Even when it's lonely. Even when it feels like you're walking away from the very thing you built with your own hands. Because sometimes, what you built isn't home anymore. Sometimes it's a cage dressed up as commitment. These days, I'm not just surviving, I'm living. I took up painting again, something I hadn't done since college. Nothing fancy, just small canvases, soft colors, whatever comes to mind after a long day. My apartment walls are covered with them now, not because they're masterpieces, but because they remind me that I'm allowed to create just for the joy of it. I hosted my first dinner party a few weeks ago. Just 4 friends, homemade pasta, and too much laughter. At one point, someone said, "Margarita, I swear you're glowing lately." And I laughed, really laughed, because I realized they were right. It wasn't just the lighting or the wine, it was me. Whole, free, no longer waiting, and I've never felt more like myself. I didn't think starting over at 36 would feel so much like starting inward, like walking back towards someone I hadn't seen in years, someone I barely remembered. But in the months after I left Luis, that's exactly what it became, a homecoming to myself. It happened in small, quiet ways at first. Like the first Sunday I didn't wake up feeling resentment. Or the first evening I sat on the couch without checking the time, wondering when he'd get up and finally do something. It was like my body had been living on high alert for so long that it didn't know how to relax, not really, until there was nothing left to brace for. But then, slowly, I did relax. I remembered how good it felt to move through the world without carrying someone else's expectations. I started taking long walks in the morning before work, no earbuds, just me and the rhythm of my own breath. I went to the movies alone for the first time in years and didn't feel lonely. I felt free. There was something powerful in that, realizing that solitude wasn't a punishment. It was a privilege. One Friday night, maybe 6 months after I'd moved out, I ran into someone I hadn't seen in ages. His name was Jordan. We used to work together at a different job back when I was fresh out of college and still figuring out who I was. We bumped into each other at a bookstore, of all places. He was holding a book I'd just finished reading, and we laughed over the coincidence. We talked for 20 minutes in the aisle like no time had passed. And as we were saying goodbye, he looked at me and said, "You seem really clear, like you've figured something out." That word stuck with me. Clear, because that's exactly what it felt like. Not perfect, not easy, but clear, like someone had wiped the fog off a mirror and I could finally see myself again. The funny thing is, the more I began living with intention, the less space I had for bitterness. It just dissolved, like old dust getting swept out of a forgotten corner. I stopped needing to replay the past, to pick apart every mistake, to wonder how Luis could have done what he did. Because I knew the answer now. He didn't see my value because he never really looked. He didn't show up because he never had to. And I kept hoping he'd grow up when I was the one doing all the growing. One day, out of nowhere, I got a message from Sasha. The Sasha. I hadn't thought about her in a long time. Her profile picture popped up on my phone like a ghost from another life. I almost deleted the message without reading it, but curiosity won. She wrote, "I don't expect you to respond. I just wanted to say, I'm sorry. I didn't know he was married at first, and when I found out, I still stayed, and that's on me. But I wanted you to know I never meant to hurt anyone. I was hurting too." I stared at her message for a long time. There was a time when I would have wanted to hate her. Needed to, but now I just felt nothing. Not anger, not sympathy, just space. And in that space, I finally saw it clearly. She wasn't my enemy. She was just another woman who got caught in the orbit of a man who promised more than he could give. Another woman who mistook charm for substance. I didn't reply. Not out of cruelty, but because there was nothing left to say. That chapter had closed long ago. Later that night, I told my best friend about the message over tea. She looked at me and smiled. "You're so calm about it." And I was. Because that's what healing does. It doesn't erase the past, it just makes it small. Quiet. Something that no longer fills the room. A few weeks after that, I ran into Luis. It was at a gas station, of all places. I was filling up, listening to music, enjoying the breeze, when I heard a familiar voice behind me say, "Margarita?" I turned. He looked older somehow. More worn. His hair was longer than I remembered, and his shoulders slouched in a way I'd never seen before. He gave me a tentative smile. "Hey," he said, "you look good." I nodded. "Thanks." There was a pause. He looked down, shuffled his feet. "I've been meaning to call." I raised an eyebrow. "Why?" He exhaled. "To say I'm sorry for everything. I really messed things up." I didn't rush to fill the silence. He waited, maybe expecting a dramatic moment, a breakdown, a second chance. But none of that was coming. "I know," I said. "You did." He nodded again, slower this time. "I thought about you a lot." "I bet you did." Another silence. He looked around the parking lot like maybe someone else would step in and rescue him from the weight of his own choices. "How's life?" he asked finally. I looked him dead in the eye and told him the truth. "It's good, really good." He nodded, but I could see the regret in his eyes. Not just for losing me, but for realizing, too late, that the life I'd built for him had never been his to waste. We said goodbye, No hugs. No lingering glances. Just two people who once shared a life and were now living very different ones. I got back in my car, rolled down the window, and drove away feeling nothing but lightness. And that's when I knew for sure. I was free. I had built a new life piece by piece out of truth and boundaries and self-worth. I'd made mistakes, sure. I'd held on too long. But I had walked away with grace, with clarity, with my head high and my heart intact, and I've come to believe that's the best kind of ending. Not the dramatic ones, not the revenge-fueled ones, but the quiet ones, the strong ones. The ones where you choose yourself again and again, until one day you realize you never needed anyone else to save you. You just needed to remember your own power.